My name is Aleem Hedi, and I'm an orthopedic surgeon in Scotland and a student at Warwick Business School. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Resilience. At the very outset, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for this forum. We've had a few technical glitches. I upgraded to a new software of Zoom. It is essentially, a collective of the like-minded, like ourselves, who have come together to form this group. We're not necessarily a formal organization, and we do not have, if you like, the full technological support that you will find from the likes of various institutions. I was hoping that we would have a forum where we could see one another, but it looks like the upgrades not worked. So I will definitely, when people put their hands up and if they want to talk, bring you in. So anyway, there are a few things to think about. It looks like, the COVID-19 crisis, apart from making us very busy, has a lot of ramifications. I mean, politically, as we know, all of a sudden, boundaries have come up in the European Union. Who saw that? What was the point of Brexit? All of a sudden, we have governments that have changed color from being right-wing to being very socialist. We have massive unemployment due to the fall in the global economy. There's been a reduction in production and the supply chain has seized and people are raiding the supermarkets. But apart from that, we've all felt loss. We've all suffered loss. We know somebody or the other who's been afflicted by COVID-19. And at a macro level, there has been disease, war has stopped, and the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, doesn't affect certain people. It affects pretty much across the spectrum. As we've seen, we've had somebody from the royal family, our own prime minister is in hospital, and let's pray for his health at this time. Yet we've seen public spiritedness. People have come forward. They've wanted to do something in the spirit of fighting, if you like, this malaise that we've all entered. Technology has become stronger, and hence I'm in front of you with Zoom. But however, we might find the paradox is that technology is probably tracking us, tracking what we are saying, and potentially, tracking our movements. As you know, facial recognition in China is now used for assessing contacts around people who've suffered from COVID. We have a lot of deregulation, and yet, on the other hand, we could find ourselves over-regulated in the future, and to some extent, you could argue that we are very deeply regulated with the lockdown. Our personal freedoms have been impinged. So there's a huge amount of change that's happened. Yes, the environment's cleaned up. How long will it be like that for? It's hard to say at this stage. So what does the future hold for us? What I would like you to do is just, I'm going to pose you this question, and in the chat boxes, I would request if you could actually put something to the effect of what you think the future holds. What are your feelings? So look, at this time where it seems desperate, at this time of despair, I would say that, it's also a time for reset. A lot is being said about how you can deal with your own problem, how you can cope with your own problem. But the attempt in this series of webinars is to actually discuss how you can think about the external environment and potentially deal with that rather than cope. Because coping comes from you, one, not being able to understand and the difficulties in understanding the external environment. So today I have Kathryn Perera with us. Kathryn Perera is the director of NHS Horizons, and she'll tell you a little bit more about it herself.
So thank you so much, and hopefully others will be able to see me here. I'm delighted to be here with you this evening. And given that this is a rapid session for us together, I'm only going to take about 12 minutes of time to introduce some ideas to you. So it's going to be quick-paced, highly practical. Please do use the chat functionality as we go through to provide feedbacks. I'll keep an eye on it for any questions and also to let me know of any problems with the tech or the audio. Hello everyone, and my name is Kathryn Perera. I work in a team called NHS Horizons. We specialise in supporting national teams to accelerate the pace of large-scale change. So you can imagine what life is like at the moment in terms of the pace of the work that we're doing. My background is as a community organiser and in political campaigning. And so I will be bringing an activist lens to this question that we have tonight around resilience. So what I'm going to do now is share some slides with you. I'll just pop these up and hopefully you can see them. So let me know if those come through. I'll keep an eye on the chat box to check that they have. Yeah, I think people can see those now. So what I want to start by doing, let me just pick up the chat messages. So thank you, Lucy, thank you, Vivek, and everyone for letting me know that you can see the slides. What I'd like to start by doing is acknowledging the context of the moment that we're in, and to acknowledge that for many of us, it is hard to see beyond the end of our noses in dealing with the response, whether we are at the point of care or whether we are supporting those at the point of care in multiple different ways. And yet what I want to do in this short time we have here together is to raise our viewpoint. And I'm going to start with this quote from John Barry's book, The Great Influenza. And this is a historical account of what happened in 1918 with what's known as the Spanish flu. And what John says is this: the story of the 1918 influenza virus is not simply one of havoc, death, and desolation, of a society fighting a war against nature, superimposed on a war against another human society. It is also a story of science, of discovery, of how one thinks, and of how one changes the way one thinks, of how amidst near utter chaos, a few people, men, sought the coolness of contemplation and the utter calm that precedes not philosophizing, but grim, determined action. And I want to invite you to enter into those words and the possibility that if we keep part of our mind tilted towards the future possibilities of some of the great things that we see being accelerated in our NHS now, then there are great opportunities that we can grab and shape for the future. So here's an activist model for thinking about those different layers of thought that can apply in our present moment. There is what we are all experiencing, that first horizon of what we can do immediately. There is, I think, for many of us, and please do share in the chat your own stories, ways in which we can extend and add and speed up great positive change that we're involved in now. But there are two horizons beyond that. And it's that I think some of our resilience can be situated in when we hold on to that bigger view. The first is the opportunity to do new things from what we have now. And the second, what we call the Horizons Activist model for the fourth horizon, is visionary, transformative, and new ideas that we can bring into the world. So when I talk about resilience, what I'm really talking about is a verb rather than a noun, something that we do rather than something that we have, a muscle that we grow as we use it. And the working definition that I'm going to use for this session of resilience, and I'll just check the chat that people can still hear me, please let me know if not. The working definition I'm going to use is that resilience is simply the ability to spring forward. And you can view it as a moment of defiance in the face of everything in our context that calls on us to have a short or narrow vision, to feel that our efforts are not enough, to think that we and our teams should give up. So resilience is an opportunity to face the challenges that we have and say, this will not stop our momentum towards our goals, towards realizing our potential. So just to acknowledge for a moment what we experience in public service, even in ordinary times. You know, our context requires that we're resilient because we are working in a highly political system. It often feels that it's based on division and criticism. It can feel overwhelming to challenge the status quo, and that's one of our major opportunities as we move through COVID-19 response. We can feel that other people don't see the potential and possibilities of our ideas and that we're ignored or not relevant. It may feel that getting recognition for accomplishments is difficult and that we have to choose our battles and even emotionally detach from situations in order to make progress. Now, some people talk about that as a resilience challenge. Some people think of it as a resistance challenge. You know, whenever we try to do new, brilliant things in the world, we meet resistance. So the first idea I want to offer in this session is, how can you think of resistance and resilience as two interconnected strategies? So that as you try to take the great opportunities that exist in a moment of change, how can you go about the change in a way that reduces people's resistance to what you're doing and attend to your own resilience and that of your team at the same time? And it's those two ideas that I want to unpack. So forgive me in the short moments I have for being intensely practical, but in terms of resistance, often this is about getting people invested in our ideas for change in order to build resilience for the long term, to be able to spring forward again and again with our teams. So what I've done here in this slide, which I hope you can see, is to set down 4 key ways in which we can reduce resistance in order to build our own individual and our collective resilience as high-performing teams. So the first one is about intentionally creating a coalition with people who have a role in the change and are impacted by it, thinking creatively and widely about that coalition of allies. The second one is paying as much attention to why we do what we do as to what it is we need to get done. So this idea of shared purpose and how we create that through good questions that we bring to our team, as well as feeling that we're bringing answers. The third one is to co-create change with people in one above, those who have a role in our change and also those impacted by it. And then the fourth one is about how we frame positive changes, the stories we tell, the stories that we adopt and adapt into the change that we're trying to make in the world. So there's 4 kind of key ways of thinking about resistance. And what I'm going to move into now is how that interlocks with this idea of resilience. And you know, what I've found in my work is that when you say the word resilience, people have almost an allergic reaction to it. So in a recent large event that we ran, we asked people to conjure up their response to the word resilience. And the most common responses were emotion and pain and endurance and distress. And we know that all of these can be part of resilience, but the story is more complex. We know, for example, that there can be a really positive correlation between being under stress and being productive. So here we have an adaptation of the Yerkes-Dodson curve, and I commend to you the Wild Monday Collective by Dr. Rachel Morris, who has a lot of materials that are specific for clinicians on her website, and that are resources you can use with your team around conversations on resilience. And what this basically shows is that if we don't have enough pressure, our performance is suboptimal, and that there's a tipping point at which we have just enough pressure to reach peak performance. But what happens, and often we can't spot this moment in time, is that the pressure can become too much, the performance goes down. And at that point, again, we're performing suboptimally. So there's something about this relationship between stress and productivity that is key to understanding resilience. And it might be a conversation piece to open up with your teams. I'm going to do a quick check-in on the chat box, and I don't think there's anything there to cover. Now, why is this challenging in the NHS? Well, I would suggest that partly it's cultural. So we have a permission culture in business as usual in the NHS that is predicated around hierarchy and structures and lots of the good things that come with expertise and discretion and having command and control around structures. But when the permission culture is out of kilter with us feeling we can get things done, it has a residual effect on our resilience as individuals trying to do our best and as teams. And it's closely linked to an idea called moral distress. And this comes from Andrew Jameton, who did a study with a group of nurses. And the study basically revealed that for many of us, we come into the NHS and healthcare because we have a deep sense of vocation. And when that vocation conflicts with the environment, with the norms, with what we're required to do, it can create a degree of emotional distress. So he defines that moral distress as when you know the right thing to do, but organizational or institutional constraints make it nearly impossible for you to pursue that course of action. So there may be something there in just surfacing this idea of moral distress with your colleagues and thinking about, you know, how far does this apply for us? What are the opportunities now in this COVID response moment for us to bring closer together what we know is the right thing to do and the relative lack of constraints that some of us may be experiencing. So what I want to move into now is just some suggestions for other parts of that conversation. And the first one is this, and I've taken this from Bob Klaber. He's a pediatrician working at Imperial in London. And I love this. He posted it on his Twitter account and it went viral. He said, we need to start team conversations from the business end of healthcare. And when he talks about the business end of healthcare, what Bob means is this. He says, my growing reflection is that we are too apologetic about kindness, compassion, and empathy. You know, often clinicians will say, I know it's soft and fluffy, but it is important. And he says, no, kindness is the business end of healthcare. And we need to start with it. So is there an opportunity culturally for putting language around kindness and empathy and a different way of thinking about our team resilience at the heart of the conversations that you're having with your teams now? And I will readily admit that this comes from an activist perspective. It comes from a perspective that says change starts with me. You know, yesterday I was clever. I thought I could change the world, but today I was wise and I started with myself. And one of the things I think this moment offers, whether you're socially isolating at home or whether you're busy and carrying points of reflection home with you from the wards or your GP surgery or wherever life finds you, there's a moment of reflection to say, what am I doing to shift my mindset that will allow me to create the conditions with others to shift theirs? So I'm going to just end, because of the time, with a few examples of what I mean. For those who are interested in this question of how do I shift my mind and my mindset and my language, I would recommend to you the work of Professor Carol Dweck. So what she does in her work is to draw a contrast between fixed mindsets, which are the ideas that we have innate talents, that we don't need feedback, that we can decide for ourselves what happens, that we should have fixed ideas about the world. And she contrasts that with what she calls a growth mindset. So that growth mindset is basically the starting premise that effort and practice are essential to improving, that there is always room to improve if we see everything as a learning opportunity, and that we can explore and change well into our older age our ideas and assumptions about the world. So a question that you might want to ask yourself and then offer into your team is, what am I doing today to create space for other people to grow their resilience? What am I enabling to happen that goes beyond myself? The last thing I want to do then is make a link between these ideas of our individual resilience and a system perspective, a perspective that acknowledges that we are all working in complex environments. And a couple of quotes that I find inspiring. So this one is from Complex Wales. And the tweet said, complex systems are driven by the quality of those interactions between the parts and not the quality of the parts themselves. So just working on discrete parts and processes can properly bugger up the performance at a system level. Never fiddle with a part. unless it also improves the system. And I think this is a really interesting idea for us as leaders. It's not simply about what I'm doing, it's also about the interactions between points in our teams and the way that that influences the resilience of the system more widely. And finally, a lot of that is based around influence rather than control. So Jennifer Garvey-Berger, one of the most wonderful developmental psychologists operating today in the world, says if we want to get serious about leading in complex environments, instead of craving control, in complexity, we have to shift towards thinking about influence. So Ali, I'm going to hand back to you at this point, and simply leave for a moment this graphic there, which I hope you can see, which summarizes a lot of what I'm talking about here. It's the difference between focusing on what we know and our skills, which are incredibly important, particularly in the immediate response to a crisis, and paying just as much attention to how we think, the complexity of our mindsets, our behaviors, how we create enabling environments for our team, rather than ones that are fixed in that first horizon of the response to a crisis. And that ultimately is how we move from just our individual resilience to thinking about resilience as a bigger concept. So Ali, I'll pause there and then I'll just work out how to hand back to you to carry on the session.
Kathryn, thank you very much. That was absolutely brilliant. Could I ask the audience to put any questions, please? We've got a question from Langley Sharp. Langley, I think your audio's on. Let me just see if you can actually ask the question directly over here.
Hi, Ali. Hi, Kathryn. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Really interesting talk. Really appreciate that. I'm really interested in your comments about hierarchy within the NHS. I'm serving in the military, so I'm very familiar with hierarchical systems and how they can be both a real advantage in a crisis, but also can stifle reaction to crisis. And I was wondering what your comments are with regards to hierarchy in the NHS, what constraints need to be overcome in order to optimise the performance of the NHS, particularly now in crisis? What needs to change?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And Ali, I'm just going to ask you to put yourself on mute while I'm speaking so we don't get some feedback from that. I think, you know, a lot of the learning that we can do from, in terms of the balance between hierarchy and networks, derives from what's been happening in the military over a number of years. So I think the military offers some great case studies, the most famous example being Stanley McChrystal's work on Team of Teams, the idea around devolving discretion for people to act, creating rapid feedback loops. A lot of the learning that we have in clinical settings in terms of how we do rapid response could be adapted and rolled out to how we think about system-wide collaboration. So one of the books that I love most at the moment is New Power by Jeremy Hymans and Henry Timms, and I'll put the book into the chat box. And what it does is to contrast two ways of thinking about power, one based on hierarchy and structure, with the underdeveloped possibilities of networks, relationships, and collaboration, particularly that new technology enables. And what I'd say in response to the question is, we have massive opportunities now to develop new power operating models and new power mindsets and behaviors that shift some of the nonsense out of the healthcare system. So when I say nonsense, I mean bureaucracy and rules that aren't really rules, and ideas that nobody can really tell you where they come from, but they're historically maintained. We have the opportunity now to create a long tail in this COVID-19 response that looks at cementing some of the things that we've been able to accelerate in the matter of days that we thought would take us years. And so that's very much where our team's focus is. How do we hardwire some of these changes in and shift the culture of the whole institution. Ali, should we take another question, or if Langley wants to come back?
I can't see any other question up, so I'll just give a quick response whilst the others are coming through. I agree, and I think I totally agree with what you've said and what Ali said. That crises often and operations in our world do create opportunities, and you need to harness them. And I like the way you've referenced culture at the end there, because it is a cultural shift, I think, to make these changes and ensure they're sustained over the long term. We've been working with the NHS for the last couple of weeks, and I guess one of my reflections is that, unlike the military, which is a clear hierarchy top to bottom, the NHS doesn't quite have that luxury, and it seems to be it has a hierarchy, but it's not necessarily connected from the national down to, or the strategic down to the tactical. The various trusts having a lot of autonomy.
Yeah, I think that's right, but I think that has an opportunity within it as well. I mean, the opportunity is to learn and utilize methods that are as much based on mobilization as they are on mandate, and that's a different leadership skill. Not why don't people follow me, but why would they, right? And developing the skills as leaders to build consent with other people, as well as just relying on our hierarchical powers. Is a big opportunity in the NHS, and probably one that we don't give enough intentional thought to.
I totally agree.
So Ali, I can see you talking, but you're on mute on your computer. There we go.
Langley, thank you very much. I mean, I think that was an excellent discussion. Kathryn, could I please ask you? A lot of people feel constrained by cliques because it is very normal, and we have discussed previously that there's a tendency for people to fall into a comfort zone, if you like, of connectedness, where you feel more connected with certain people who share your values. Is there, I mean, are you sort of, do you have any advice on how do people break down barriers? How do you break down the cliques to be able to actually make yourself felt and reach that state of self-actualization where you feel you're making a difference?
Yeah, I think it's natural, isn't it, in moments of crisis to some extent, that we fall back on what, from our perception of the world, works. And that often, for all of us, that mirrors to some extent our own proclivities, preferences, what we perceive strength to be. So I think there's a point of reflection here for all of us who are in leadership roles to question whether we're doing that. So I am talking about things such as unconscious bias. I am talking about things, in my talk, Ali, I referenced Bob Klaber saying kindness is the business end of healthcare. For me, diversity and inclusiveness are allies to that, and they are the business end of healthcare. One of the things that worries me at the current moment is the lack of discussion around how we can accelerate opportunities for quite, they can feel ungrounded ideas like diversity and inclusion. So I think the leadership challenge is, how do we ground those ideas in our current experience and use this moment of crisis to accelerate profound change on those aspects of our culture in the health service? So I think partly on the cliques thing, it starts with some self-awareness, raising it as a topic so that people feel safer to explore it together, and then putting in place some intentional steps that move through that second and third horizon to use this opportunity to make some profound changes in the way we operate.
Yes, I mean, one of my concerns is that we're heading headlong into the crisis. It's a bit reminiscent of a war effort, where everybody heads into the war effort, but there's no planning. So there are many examples where the aftermath of the war is less successful. And my particular concern is that unless there is proper planning for the aftermath or the afterlife of this crisis, there could potentially be a double tsunami where you have a burnt out staff not being able to address the surge in demand, which is why the sense would be that there needs to be some planning, and planning on an innovative footing about how we address that. We have discussed before that the First World War, for example, eventually led to universal suffrage, where women got the vote. In the Second World War, we had the Queen driving trucks, and that led to, if you like, more empowerment for women in the workplace. So, I mean, what would be your comment? How do we sort of plan ahead? Would you advise that we plan for the recovery now, or is there any evidence to show that there's a certain time where you plan for the recovery and resilience then?
So I guess my answer to that would be an aphorism or a sort of heuristic, which is, you know, the way that you go about the future determines the future that you get. So I think we have an opportunity now to be paying attention to the process that we are using to address some of those questions. So I'll give you an example. I've been involved at NHS England and Improvement in starting to think through the recovery support offer. So what is happening now that's good, that we want to accelerate, that aligns with the long-term plan and speeds it up? And what do we therefore want to keep pushing on as we come out of the immediate, we hope, crisis period of COVID-19? Now that's important. That's the structural piece. But I wish we paid as much attention to how are we developing our relationships with local and national and regional communities? How are we taking learning from sectors like the military and social care and VCSEs, the charity sectors? And how are we developing their capacity to tell us what is working and what is learning in order to shape our response? And it's that two-way process that I feel needs, and this is just my personal view, but needs recalibrating and paying as much attention to the process by which we're thinking about how we come out of this in better shape, and not just what the outputs are going to be at the end.
Fantastic. We've got a question from Vivek Srivastav. Vivek, could you?
Yes, thanks, Ali. Kathryn, can I?
Vivek, you're meant to be a co-host on this program.
Yeah, and right.
Technological unfamiliarity.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Right. Okay. Kathryn, fantastic talk, of course. Can I ask, lots of ad hoc teams being put up now, and that's obviously quite different to me than team members who have worked together for years and years together, or not even years, but at least become familiar with each other. And they have much more of an opportunity to grow and leadership to kind of influence the team members. How do people, or how should people interact in the current setting where teams can change from day to day so an objective can be achieved and people can grow together?
That's a huge question, Vivek. I'm going to invite people also to put some responses into the chat for that one. And just before I answer, Vivek, I can see, Ali, there's some people with some hands raised in the attendees. That might be people wanting to come in with questions potentially. My answer, because I'm a community organizer, is always to return to the story. So the law exists to give us structure. This is the old sort of Jewish proverb. The law exists to give us structure, but the law is only credible because it's rooted in a story, normally a story of something that's gone wrong. And over time, we need to rebalance between the structure, the law, and the story, which is the activism, the campaigning, the redressing of grievance. And I think we're at a moment now, and when you bring teams together for the first time, when the most important thing is stories about us, who we are, why we do what we do, why we don't do other things, and what we share together, those stories that talk about our common values. And then the third story is a story of now. So there's the story of me and who I am, how that connects with you. And that can be a really lovely way to short circuit trying to work effectively together. And then there's the story of now, the urgency of what we need to deliver together. So I think my short answer would be, if we pay attention to those three stories, and we as leaders can give an account of not just what we do, but who we are and why it matters, then we're much more likely to build trust at speed.
Fantastic.
That is brilliant. Thanks, Kathryn. That is very explanatory. Thank you.
We've got a question from Virginia Davis. Virginia, could you please come in?
Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Your comments on what I've put in my chat, which is thinking about the huge levels of social inequality that we now have in this country and the massive impact they have on health and life outcomes. And a lot of the conversation I feel at the moment in relation to COVID is centred around teams in relation to acute trust settings, community hubs involving primary care, that sort of thing. But we're not particularly talking about large scale population health strategies that ultimately are way more a kind of determinative of how we all come out of pandemics or any sort of illness threat, really.
Yes, and I think to echo and emphasize that, I completely agree with you, Virginia. So I think we lost your audio a bit at the start, so I'll just repeat a bit of what you've put, which is, you know, there's a huge opportunity here to reduce the large inequality we have in our society. And we know that that has a massive impact on people's health and life outcomes. I'll give you an example. We're doing some work with the thousands of mutual aid groups that have sprung up all over the country and trying to connect them into NHS volunteering efforts in local communities. And of course, when you map those, as we've been doing with some of the big tech companies, they neatly correlate onto areas of you know, high community assets, more affluent areas where we already have community infrastructure, and areas that are in relative deprivation in community terms don't see that proliferation of self-organized efforts. So there is a huge risk here that we are strengthening disparities which we know already exist in our society. And I can see that quite a few people are commenting on that in the chat box, which is great.
Fantastic. Do you have anything to say about that, Virginia?
Well, the only other bit that I was mentioning on the chat is about the decimation of public health structures in this country over the last decade, and just thinking about, you know, how this situation might cause some reflection by, you know, government, NHS England, about where the focus is in terms of health management.
Right, we've got some questions. Do you think it's only bureaucratic issues? What about people that are hiding behind their anxiety and safety create more obstacles? Question from Pavlos Papaloudis.
It's great. It's slightly uncomfortable for me doing question and answer because I always want to throw it open, fully aware that there are, you know, 50 people here who have expertise and ideas. No, I don't think it's purely bureaucratic, but I think bureaucratic is a shorthand, isn't it, as a word for describing some of the problematic elements of structural approaches to change. I don't think bureaucracy is an amorphous beast living on its own either. Bureaucracy is made up of the sum of individual human decisions that inform a culture which we can either choose to try and break or to reinforce. So I do think ultimately it comes back to individual agency, and how we build that with others to make different futures. Or, as you say, how we choose to, or are maybe compelled towards feelings of fear and anxiety and paralysis. And in many ways, it's things like this that bring us together as a community, that build our confidence and our bravery to act differently.
Fantastic.
Hi, thank you. So just what Kathryn was saying about growing together, but I guess this is valid for all kinds of crises. The first phase we go through is the fear zone, where we have seen this maybe about coming up to a month ago now. People were hoarding stuff and people were so fearful of all the things. But then we started to slowly understand and started to learn about how we should, how this is going to impact us. And we started to kind of identify our emotions. We started to become aware of the situation and also evaluate lots of information flying around on WhatsApp messages and emails about what could be true, what could not be. Of course, there is a whole plethora of information out there. But then we are now slowly starting to enter growth zone. I'm sure lots of people will relate to this. And we've started to develop small communities within communities. And we have started to see how we can help each other, how we can help our elderly neighbors, how we can live in the present and focus on the future. And this is sort of the focus of the webinar series as well. And then enter a happy emotional state and be hopeful for the future and spread hope as well. And this is again one of the objectives of this seminar. On that note, yeah. Sorry.
No, please carry on.
Sorry. No, sorry, Ali. I was just going to say, did you want to summarize and probably introduce the next topics or?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Thanks,
So, I'd like
Kathryn.
to thank everybody for being with us. In summary, be positive. Try and be part of the team. Like Kathryn said, I think the best way of being in a team is to be kind, demonstratively kind. Just ask about people, find out how they're doing. And yes, on one hand, it is important not to take, if you like, people have different personalities, and we will cover personality as well as part of our series. There's nothing personal. People are under stress. There's that moral distress. But yes, in this time, like Kathryn said, a lot of constraints have been loosened. This is the time where people can come into their own and actually develop the change that they want to be, so that they can bring that change. It is important to form a collaboration with internal partners. You build a network and try and influence people rather than control people. But the external partners are key because they have a unique set of learning that perhaps organizations within the health service may not necessarily do so, because it can't be generalized. Every organization has its own unique experience. It is very important to sort of understand what new power is. So you talk about formal organizational structures, and you are, in a sense, part of the informal organizational structure and leadership. We will be alluding to that in a further discussion about who's a leader and who's a follower. Are we leaders, all of us? And the short answer to that would be we are leaders. We have the ability to influence, because that's what leadership is about. So do try and exercise new power, because if new power is exercised, then the voice will be heard upwards rather than, if you like, command coming from below. So, I mean, I've tried to summarize essentially what was an excellent discussion from Kathryn. Kathryn, could you please come in, and if there's anything else that, I might have missed out, please put it forward. I mean, what would be your take-home message?
Well, I think just to say that being part of this community this evening gives me hope. I've got a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old downstairs. Like everybody else, I'm doing kind of 12-hour days, fitting things in between. And we need social food. We need spiritual food to move into that growth zone, which you and Vivek have described. So taking these chances to connect and ground ourselves is so important. Thank you for inviting me to come and join you.
And just before you go, again, I'd like to thank all the participants, you, Kathryn, and then a lot of people in the audience who actually are experts in the field of leadership and governance. So we had Professor Bernard Crump, Professor Jerry McGiven from Warwick Business School, Vivek Srivastava is a cardiothoracic surgeon in Oxford. Kathryn, no doubt, is an expert, and she's the director of NHS Horizons, part of NHS Improvement and NHS England. I have to say that we have 2 excellent speakers in our program next week, so you can see that. A notice will be going out for this, and I promise you that next time there won't be any polls. We will have, if you like, a standard meeting and try and bring in as many people as possible. So please do come and join us for the Resilience, where we will have Steve Ingham, who's a director and performance scientist who's trained the likes of Jessica Ennis-Hill, who talks about the importance of how to regulate performance, how to get the best and different techniques, especially under extreme pressure. As you would appreciate that, Jessica Ennis-Hill, Sir Stephen Redgrave, and Sir Matthew Pinson would have been. We've also got the program director for the Executive MBA program of Warwick Business School in London, Dimitrios Spiridonidis, who is an expert in leadership, and he'll be talking about managing one's self, which is what Kathryn alluded to. So I'd say to you that this series will be covering the management of one's self, but more from the point of view of managing the external, or controlling, or not necessarily controlling, but trying to understand and regulating the effect of the external environment on yourself, rather than the standard things that you would talk about. It is important to be active. It is important to take breaks. Yes, it is important to do those things, but understanding the external environment is just as important. At this point, I'd like to say bye and wish you the very best of health and well-being. We all need that. I'll leave the chat box open, and I would really appreciate if you could if you give your comments about how you felt about this session, how you felt your knowledge was about high-performing teams, and how this session might have shaped it or not, and suggestions for future sessions. So I'll leave the chat box open. And on that note, I'd like to thank all of you. And again, keep well. Thank you.
And please do send us your email IDs, because it'll be good to get back to you in person.
And next time we'll have all the screens open, okay? So none of this sort of polling and all that. We want everybody to take part. All the very best, and pass the word round. Bye-bye.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kathryn. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you very much, Kathryn. Bye-bye.